He was only a boy, blind, overlooked, and dismissed before he ever touched a piano key. In a room filled with talent and pride, a world-famous pianist thought it would be amusing to let him play, just for fun. But what began as mockery soon unraveled into something no one expected. His hands revealed a truth that silenced the crowd and exposed a painful reality about prejudice, brilliance, and how we see one another. What happened that day was more than music, it was a reckoning. Would you have seen his gift, or his blindness first? He grew up in a world that often told him what he couldn't do. Born blind in a small neighborhood where opportunity was scarce, music was his escape, his way of painting pictures no eyes could see. At home, his fingers danced across a second-hand piano, the keys worn down but alive with possibility. To his family, he was a miracle, to the outside world, just another boy with limits. He never asked for pity, only a chance to be heard. That chance would come sooner than anyone imagined, inside a grand concert hall where judgment waited, disguised as laughter. And once he sat at the piano, nothing would ever be the same again. The hall was grand, marble pillars reaching high into the ceiling, chandeliers glittering like stars, and rows of velvet seats filled with people dressed in their finest. For the young boy, it was a world far removed from the cracked sidewalks and modest homes of his neighborhood. He was led carefully through the crowd, his hand resting gently on his mother's arm. Every step echoed louder than the last, as though the building itself was whispering, "You don't belong here." The boy had been invited, but not in kindness. Whispers spread even before he entered, some curious, others cruel. "That's him," one voice murmured. "The blind kid who thinks he can play." A chuckle followed, cold and sharp. They weren't expecting brilliance, they were expecting entertainment. To them, his presence was a novelty, a joke, something to pass the time before the real performance began. At the center of it all was the famous pianist. Known worldwide, adored by critics, celebrated for his genius, he stood as the embodiment of classical music's highest pedestal. Yet, behind his polished smile was arrogance, and behind his welcome was something darker. He didn't see the boy as a fellow musician, or even as a child, he saw him as a prop. When he spoke to the crowd, his voice dripped with false warmth. "Tonight, we have a special guest." The pause lingered just long enough for polite laughter. "A young man who believes he has a talent to share with us. Let's give him a round of applause." The clapping was scattered, hesitant, tinged with mockery. Some faces smiled, but not with kindness, only the indulgent smirk of people ready to witness a stumble. The boy couldn't see their expressions, but he could feel them. He had grown up with that sensation, the silent weight of being judged before he ever spoke, ever touched a key, ever proved himself. His heart pounded. He wasn't naive, he knew why he had been brought there. Not to be celebrated, but to be tested, perhaps even humiliated. Yet something inside him, something that had carried him through years of being overlooked, refused to break. His mother's hand squeezed his shoulder, a small gesture that said everything words could not. "Play," she whispered softly. And with that, he was led to the piano. The piano itself was magnificent, glossy black, towering, its keys gleaming under the spotlight. For many in the room, it symbolized status, wealth, and refinement. But for the boy, it was something else entirely. To him, the piano was not a symbol, it was a voice. His voice. The only one the world had never been able to take from him. As he sat down, he could hear the faint sound of stifled laughter. A cough disguised as a chuckle. A whispered, "This should be good." He placed his hands on the keys, and in that silence, the weight of history seemed to press against him, not just his own, but generations before him. How many had been silenced? How many had been told, "You can't," simply because of the color of their skin, or because of a perceived limitation? He knew that weight all too well. And tonight, it sat heavy on his small shoulders. The first notes that left the piano were hesitant, soft, almost questioning. Some in the audience smirked, believing their expectations were correct, that he was no prodigy, just a boy fumbling in the dark. But then, something changed. The notes gathered strength. They rose, weaving into patterns that spoke of struggle and triumph, sorrow and hope. His fingers danced with a confidence that stunned even those who wanted to laugh. Each chord seemed to challenge the room. Will you still doubt me now? The audience shifted. Whispers faded into silence. Even the famous pianist, who had leaned smugly against the piano at first, now straightened. His smile faltered. He had expected noise, nothing more. But what he was hearing was mastery, something raw and untrained, yet undeniably brilliant. And still, the tension lingered. Because brilliance alone was not always enough to change hearts hardened by prejudice. Some sat with arms folded, unwilling to yield their disbelief. Others whispered explanations. It must be memorized. Someone must have taught him a trick. They searched for reasons to dismiss what was happening, rather than accept it for what it was. The boy kept playing. Every key he struck was more than music. It was defiance. It was proof. It was a voice refusing to be silenced. But then, something unexpected happened. Halfway through his piece, the pianist interrupted. With a forced chuckle, he leaned down and said loud enough for the crowd to hear, "Impressive for someone like you. But let's see how you handle this." He slid onto the bench beside the boy and began to play, fast, sharp, aggressive. The notes clashed against the boy's melody, as though the pianist wasn't joining him but battling him. It was no longer just music, it was a challenge, a test, a public attempt to expose the boy as inferior. The crowd leaned forward, tension crackling in the air. Could the boy keep up? Would he falter? The pianist's fingers moved like lightning, striking with precision and arrogance. The boy paused for only a second, listening, not with his eyes, but with something deeper. Then, slowly, his hands followed. Not copying, not mimicking, but responding. Where the pianist struck hard, the boy answered with grace. Where the pianist tried to overwhelm, the boy wove in melodies that balanced and transformed the chaos into harmony. What began as a cruel game of dominance was shifting into something else entirely, a duel the boy refused to lose. Gasps rippled through the hall. The famous pianist's expression darkened. He played harder, faster, throwing every ounce of his skill into the performance. Yet the boy never fell behind. His music soared, not just with skill, but with something the pianist could never replicate, soul. Every note carried the weight of his journey, his pain, his hope. And that was something technique alone could never conquer. Still, the test was not over. The pianist leaned in, whispering harshly under the music, "You don't belong here." His words weren't for the audience, they were for the boy alone. But the boy did not flinch. He only pressed harder into the keys, letting the music answer where words could not. The duel continued, stretching on in a dizzying whirlwind of sound. The crowd was no longer laughing. They were no longer smirking. They were transfixed, caught between disbelief and awe. And then, it happened. The boy shifted the melody, lifting it higher, carrying it into a place even the pianist could not follow. The famous man's hands faltered, just for a moment, but in that moment, the balance shifted. The duel was no longer equal. It was the boy's stage now. The pianist pulled back, his fingers slowing. He had meant to expose the boy, but instead, he had exposed himself, his arrogance, his cruelty, his prejudice. And in front of everyone, the blind boy's gift had risen above it all. Yet, even as the music filled the hall with triumph, the tension did not vanish. Because while the audience was stunned, the question remained, would they truly see him now? Or would they walk away, chalking it up to a fleeting spectacle, a story to tell over dinner but nothing more? The boy could not know. All he could do was keep playing. His fingers pressed on, carrying not just his voice but the voices of all those who had been silenced before him. And as the last notes began to rise, the hall held its breath. Something was about to break, something far greater than music. The final notes of the boy's playing lingered in the air like echoes of a truth too heavy to vanish. The hall was frozen, stunned, caught between disbelief and something deeper, something unspoken. For the first time that night, silence was not cruel. It was reverent. But then came the sound that broke it. A single clap. Sharp. Slow. Measured. It came from the pianist himself. He smiled, a smile not of admiration, but of condescension. And as his hands met together, others reluctantly followed, unsure whether to cheer or remain silent. The applause that filled the room was not entirely genuine. For some, it was relief that the moment was over. For others, it was performance, a show of civility that hid the prejudice still burning underneath. The boy sat there, hands trembling on the keys, his chest rising and falling with the weight of everything he had just poured into the music. For a brief moment, he believed, hoped, that he had been seen. That maybe, just maybe, the walls between him and the world had cracked. But then the pianist leaned into the microphone and spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began smoothly, "what you have just witnessed is truly remarkable. For a child with such limitations, to create such sound, it's almost miraculous." The words landed heavy, sharper than any silence. They were not praise. They were not recognition. They were a cage, framing the boy not as an equal, not as an artist, but as an exception, a spectacle. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but many nodded, accepting the statement without thought. The boy's gift had not been honored. It had been othered. His triumph twisted into pity, his brilliance diminished into a novelty act. And then came the cruelest blow. The pianist turned to him with a false smile and said, "Thank you for your little performance, son. Now, let's allow the professionals to continue." The boy's chest tightened. Heat burned behind his eyes, not from shame, but from the ache of injustice. He had given everything, laid his soul bare, and still, he was nothing more than a prop. The hall erupted into applause again, this time louder, drowning out the truth of what had just happened. His mother rushed to his side, guiding him off the stage. Her hand shook as it held his, but her grip was strong. She whispered comfort he couldn't fully hear above the clapping. Every step away from the piano felt like retreat. Every cheer felt like mockery. In the corridor behind the stage, the noise faded into echoes. He pressed his hands against the cool wall, struggling to steady his breath. His mother's voice was soft, pleading, "You did so well, baby. You showed them." But deep down, he wondered, did I? Because what he felt most wasn't triumph, it was erasure. He had played with everything inside him, yet all they had seen was his blindness, his skin, his difference. The gift that should have shattered stereotypes had been reduced to a sideshow. And then, the unthinkable happened. As they prepared to leave quietly through the back door, a group of attendees caught sight of them. Some clapped politely, but others sneered. One man muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Cute trick. Bet he practiced that one song for months." Another chimed in, "He should be grateful we let him play at all." The boy froze. He couldn't see their faces, but their voices painted the picture vividly enough, faces twisted with disdain, eyes sharp with prejudice. It wasn't just humiliation anymore. It was a reminder of the world he lived in, one that would always try to measure his worth through its own broken lens. His mother's grip tightened, urging him forward. But the voices followed. Someone laughed. Another voice, dripping with cruelty, said, "Imagine if he could see, maybe then he'd really be worth something." The words cut deeper than any silence ever had. The boy's chest ached, his breath coming sharp. For a moment, he thought about shouting back, defending himself, proving them wrong all over again. But he knew, that no matter how loud his voice was, it would be drowned out by theirs. He felt trapped between two worlds, the music that gave him freedom, and the reality that kept chaining him down. And in that moment, standing in the shadows of the grand hall, he realized that what had happened wasn't just about him. It was about every child who had ever been mocked for their difference. Every voice that had been silenced by arrogance disguised as authority. Every gift that had been dismissed because of the hands that held it. But this was not the end. Because as he and his mother walked out into the cold night air, something shifted inside him. The pain was still raw, the injustice still heavy, but beneath it burned a fire, one that would not be extinguished. He understood something now, their applause had never been his validation, and their cruelty could never erase his gift. He didn't need their permission to play. He didn't need their acceptance to create. His music was bigger than their prejudice. And though the hall had mocked him, the world beyond its doors was waiting. Waiting for a sound it had never heard before. That night, he made a silent vow. He would not stop. He would not fade into the background of their narrative. He would keep playing, louder, stronger, until even those who tried to silence him could not ignore the truth of who he was. The climax of his pain became the beginning of his purpose. But the world was not ready to let go of its cruelty so easily. For as his story spread, so too did the whispers. Some called him a genius. Others dismissed him as a fraud. And the same question lingered: would they finally see his gift, or would they keep seeing only what they wanted to? As the boy lay in bed that night, his fingers moved restlessly against the blanket, mimicking the keys of a piano. He could still hear the echoes of the hall, the laughter, the clapping, the cruelty. But louder than all of it was the music inside him, a music that no prejudice could erase. And though he did not know it yet, his journey had only just begun. Because one performance may not have changed the hall that night, but it had planted a seed. And seeds, once buried, have a way of growing in places no one expects. The question now was not whether he had a gift. That was undeniable. The question was, would the world ever be ready to truly hear it? And if not, would he play anyway? He had been mocked, dismissed, and used as a spectacle. Yet the music inside him refused to die. The world wanted to silence him, but could it? Or was this only the beginning of something far greater than anyone could imagine? The hall lights dimmed, and the echoes of applause faded into memory, but the boy carried something far heavier than sound. That night, he left with a truth carved deep into his spirit: talent alone would never shield him from prejudice. His gift could silence a crowd, but it could not silence the ignorance that followed him like a shadow. And yet, that shadow did not swallow him. In the days and weeks that followed, his story spread beyond the grand walls of the concert hall. Some shared it as a curiosity, the blind boy who played like a master. Others told it as a miracle, proof of human resilience. But for him, it was neither miracle nor trick. It was the reality of a boy who had lived his whole life underestimated, who had found a voice where the world saw only silence. The cruel words of that night still echoed in his mind, but so did the music he created. And slowly, he began to understand: the pianist may have mocked him, the crowd may have doubted him, but the music that lived inside him was untouchable. It belonged to no one else. It could not be erased by pity, dismissed by arrogance, or confined to a stage meant for someone else's pride. That was his victory. Because every note he played was more than sound, it was survival. Every melody was an act of defiance against a world that tried to define him by what he lacked, rather than what he possessed. And that's what racism often does. It tells people they are less than, even when they are more than enough. It dismisses brilliance, twists beauty into novelty, and places chains on those born to soar. For some, those chains are never broken. But for him, music was the key. Years later, the boy's gift would inspire countless others. Some who had felt the sting of prejudice heard his story and found strength. Parents told their children about the blind boy who silenced a hall of doubters, reminding them that their worth was never defined by the cruelty of others. His music outlived the mockery. His story outshined the arrogance. But it's not just about him. Because his journey reflects a larger truth. One that stretches far beyond music, beyond stages, beyond any single moment of injustice. It is the story of countless voices silenced before they are ever heard. Of children dismissed before they are ever seen. Of gifts buried beneath the weight of a world too blind to recognize them. And it leaves us with a question, one that cannot be ignored. How many more brilliant lives will be dimmed before we finally learn to see beyond skin, beyond circumstance, beyond prejudice? The boy's music asked that question with every note. Tonight, it's our turn to answer. So as you leave this story, don't let it end here. Carry it. Share it. Reflect on the ways prejudice still lives among us, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence, sometimes in the applause that hides condescension. And then ask yourself, what role will you play? Because change doesn't begin in concert halls or headlines. It begins in us, in the way we choose to see, to listen, to value every voice, even the ones the world tries to silence. He was mocked, underestimated, dismissed. But his gift refused to die. And maybe the real question isn't whether the world was ready for him. Maybe the question is, are we ready now?